I'm Scott Rodell here at the Great River Tao Center, and here we have a late Qing, perhaps early Republican jian. These are very typical for the period, and they often appeared in many martial arts manuals published in the early Republic in the 1920s, particularly in Chen Weiming's Taiji Jian manual. And because of that, many people tend to think that this is a very typical Qing jian, but it actually has a number of features that are quite different than jian from just 50 or 100 years earlier. One of the first things you'll notice about these jian is particularly wide guards. If you compare them with those of earlier jian, they typically are about twice as wide and of course much taller as well. This particular jian also has a unique feature, something quite different that I haven't seen on other Qing era jian or even Republican era jian, and that is a steel covered scabbard. Nobody knows why that would be. There's nothing written down to tell us that, but it's likely because in the late Qing dynasty, when they organized the new Qing army, they started using Western style military sabers, and those of course had steel scabbards. So perhaps that's where they got the idea. And in the late Qing, there were a number of European features adapted onto Chinese swords. This particular jian is also much longer than your typical Qing jian. Typical Qing jian would be around 29 inches long. That would be about 75 centimeters and weighed about 850, maybe 900 grams, especially if it's one you're thinking of using in any kind of dueling or self-defense situation. This one is considerably longer than that. This one is 31.5 inches long. That's 80 centimeters. Also, this one is particularly heavy. It weighs 2 pounds, 3 ounces. That's 992 grams. So it's quite a heavy jian. And that's why we also see this very long grip. It's not so that you can grip it with two hands. Of course you can. You can wield this sword with two hands because of the long grip. It's not a two-handed sword. It needs that extra long hilt to balance the extra long blade. So it's a very interesting sword because it's quite different than earlier Qing swords. The other thing that's really different about this sword is it's fairly thin. While it's quite long, it's also very thin. And of course it would have to be. Any sword of this kind of length, close to 32 inches in length, if it were thick as earlier swords, really robust kind of blade that way, you'd find it was just way too heavy to wield. So, if you think about it, you're using about the same amount of steel. If you're going to make it longer, you're going to have to make it thinner, or it's just simply too heavy. That makes this actually an interesting sword from a number of points of view. One is that it's very springy. As you can see from a light tap, and it really is quite springy. It would also be a blade that would really be sharp and cut very well. On the other hand, it would lack the structural strength of a blade that was not as wide and thicker. So this is the kind of sword that really wouldn't do well on the battlefield. If you try to cut into or deflect a heavy weapon or strike a polearm, a hardwood polearm, this sword would likely be damaged. The edge wouldn't really stand up to that kind of work. So it kind of begs the question then, why was this sword like this? And also have to say, from a practitioner's point of view, yes, it's nice. I can wield it without difficulty. I've been training for some time, so it's not difficult to wield. I can bring it around and move it quickly. But that extra length really adds to the torque, as does the extra weight, really make it a little more difficult to control. So if I were thinking if I were had to really be in a duel, I would not choose a sword like this. I would prefer one that was 29 inches, maybe 800, 850 grams, enough weight to deliver a solid cut, but not so much that it was difficult to control, especially, in the heat of combat. I don't want to lose my tip control. So that kind of wonders, well, what was the purpose of this kind of sword? And I would say, from the practitioner's point of view, it's very good for training. Might not have been so great on a battlefield or a dueling situation, but this was a period when people had firearms. Firearms aplenty. There were in China at that time. So there wasn't really a need for training with sword for self-defense. At that period, when there were so many firearms, people still did train and practice, of course. And there was also the self-strengthening movement. And if you think about it in those terms, maybe it wasn't relevant on the battlefield, this long blade with the thin cross-section, but it was very useful in training because it tends to test your abilities to control the blade when it's so long. Also, that very thin structure really is nice for developing the faji and getting that sense of being able to transmit your power to the blade. So this sword I find is very useful, very interesting for practice, but not my first choice if this were a life and death situation. And so there you have it. Typical late Qing Jian, not what we would see as a standard earlier in a dynasty. One other typical feature of these late Qing Jian is that they have these panels etched at the base, one on each side. Here on this side it has a nice sort of forest scene with a pine tree. The other side has three characters, Qing Feng Jian, so Qing sharp sword. I hope you've enjoyed this episode of Chinese Swords and Swordsmanship, and if you did, we always appreciate a thumbs up, and if you would subscribe, we'd also appreciate that as well. Until next time, thanks and 再见!